There can be a tendency to view folklore as antiquated customs, old legends, or outdated practices. Yet folklore is not disconnected from contemporary life and is an ever-evolving part of our lived experience. Folk music and folk art would be two obvious branches, yet dialect and language would be another. Louise Pound refers to dialect as linguistic law and as a species of folklore, while J.D.A. Widdowson even described language and folklore as those twin pillars on which the whole fabric of our cultural tradition rests. True, language does evolve and change over time, but accents and dialects are also at risk of being lost as more people adopt the non-specific or generic accents they hear online. But as dialects run parallel to folklore and preserve traditions in linguistic form, I thought it high time that we visit a specific dialect, mine. So let's explore some of the background of the Geordie dialect and some of its phrases in this week's episode of Fabulous Folklore. Hello there and welcome to Fabulous Folklore, the podcast for all things folklore, occult and just a bit weird. I'm your host, Icy Sedgwick, blogger, fantasy author and your guide into these rather mysterious realms. I've got some rare things to show you, so come on in, take a look around, but be careful not to touch anything. These things sometimes bite. Well, hello there, and welcome back to Fabulous Folklore with me, your host, Icy Sedgwick. Welcome also to 2025. Obviously, this is the first episode of a new year, and this is also the first episode of a new theme, which is really interesting because there is no theme. And this month is going to be all about those episodes which don't really fit in with any other themes, and I just thought I still want to cover them anyway. So there we go. So we're going to start off with looking at dialects, which you might think is a bit of a strange thing to have a look at on a folklore podcast. But one thing I have noticed online is there is a weird tendency for people to assume that folklore is like from the 19th century. And I think people forget that folklore is actually still going on now. So every tradition you have, every superstition you still practice, every family tradition that you have, you're still contributing towards the body of folklore through lived experience. And I think that's something that we sometimes forget goes on. And one of those things that fits in with that is things like dialect and language. And as I said in the introduction, there are actually some people who've had a look at dialect as a form of folklore. And the interest in folklore as a subject does predate an interest in dialect, that is important to point out, but they aren't mutually exclusive. As Louise Pound points out, dialects represent common speech, as well as, and I quote, local and regional peculiarities of language, end quote. And this is basically where dialects differ from accents. So an accent is basically how you say words and how you pronounce things, while a dialect will probably involve different words entirely. So I might speak English to you right now with a Geordie accent, but if I was speaking in the Geordie dialect, you might struggle to understand what I was saying unless you spoke the dialect as well. And that's the difference between an accent and a dialect. And as I said in the introduction, there is a risk that dialects can be lost, particularly as people move around a lot more than they used to. Communities aren't as insular as they used to be, and it becomes that thing where sometimes you can lose an accent on purpose because it makes you stand out within a group. And you find this also as well, it's quite funny if you look at Geordie actors in particular, they'll have like a posh voice for when they're being interviewed, and you'll only ever really get to hear their proper accent if they're actually cast as a Geordie in something. And that's really weird. I mean, I personally don't necessarily talk in person the way that I do on the podcast because I'm aware that obviously my audience is wider than just Newcastle. But if you heard me and my mother speaking, for example, we use the dialect quite a lot with each other. But obviously I just use the accent on the podcast basically so you can understand what I'm saying. Now, I have actually wanted to do this topic for a while and I wasn't quite sure where to fit it, but now I'm having like a miscellaneous month. It seems high time to actually have a look at it. So people have sometimes asked me where I'm from. The big question that I often get from people outside the British Isles is which part of Scotland am I from? And obviously I'm not from Scotland. So instead, I thought I'd have a look at Geordies. And I think it's probably best to start with a definition of a Geordie to help the people outside of the UK situate the accent. And it turns out that the definition gets really contentious. Some people think you can only be a Geordie if you're actually from Newcastle upon Tyne. Others think it's anywhere on Tyneside. But even defining the extent of Tyneside is quite difficult because Newcastle has been both a city and a county in the past, and North and South Tyneside are also separate council areas, so it does get a little bit sticky on this particular point. Now, we could potentially defer to Dan Jackson, author of the Northumbrians, for this one, and he points out that historically Geordies came from the industrial areas of Northumberland and Durham, and actually even included those from Sunderland as well. and the separate Mackem identity for people in Sunderland is much newer. But with Jackson's definition, you could then call yourself a Geordie if you were from Tyneside, Wearside, or the old coalfield areas of the northeast, and obviously right up into Northumberland as well. Now, there is also some dialect slippage between Northumbria and Newcastle, and that's basically because Northumbria was an ancient kingdom and it actually stretched from the Firth of Forth in Scotland right down to the Humber River. And until 651, it was actually two kingdoms. So you had Bernicia in the north and Daria in the south. Now, the Danes conquered Daria in the mid-10th century, which then went on to form the Kingdom of York, but the portion north of the Tweed became part of Scotland, and then eventually what was left became the counties of Northumberland and Durham. Now, what is rather cool is the way that many words still in use in the Geordie dialect would have actually been recognisable to the Venerable Bede, who's probably one of our more famous exports. He's often widely considered to be one of the greatest scholars of his age, and he was born in the 670s and died in the 730s. And he's just one of these really learned people who put out tons and tons of books and made quite a lot of discoveries, which to us seem obvious, but obviously at the time wouldn't have been. But anyway, given that when he was sort of knocking about in like the 7th and the early 8th century, he would have recognised some of these words as well, which I think is really cool. So as an example, we have a particular phrase, I'll learn you, which means I'll teach you or I'll teach you a lesson. And some people try and translate learn as learn, which is actually wrong, because learn comes from the Anglian verb lauren, meaning to teach. You're actually being grammatically correct saying I'll learn you, because you're actually saying I'll teach you, not I'll learn you, and a few people make a mistake with that one. And interestingly, other Geordie words like hoose, meaning house, deed, meaning dead, and gan, meaning going, are basically much the same as they were in Bede's day as well. Now, as Alistair Moffat notes, and I quote, the major regional dialects are still directly traceable to the Anglo-Saxon period, even corresponding to those areas which coalesced into the ancient kingdoms, end quote. So the Northumbrian dialect, and bearing in mind how big Northumbria was, then features, and I quote, a Bernician subdivision otherwise known as Geordie, end quote. Now, there is actually some evidence to suggest that everyone spoke the dialect on Tyneside, irrespective of class, before the introduction of boarding schools in the 19th century. And if that is then indeed true, it does make me wonder how many of the people in these Jane Austen novels would have actually spoken with regional accents rather than received pronunciation, which would make Pride and Prejudice a very different book entirely. Now, Geordie does share some words with Scots. It's not surprising because obviously we did have the reach of Northumbria up to the Firth of Forth, and that whole area was quite contested between England and Scotland did keep trying to annex Northumberland and Tyneside right up until the Battle of Flodden Field in 1513. At that point, they were essentially trying to get land back, I would argue, but there we go. But there we do find words again like deed or burn, which means a stream, and bairn or child originate in the language of the Angles, because a lot of people think that we borrowed the words from Scotland, but it actually went the other way around. And the Angles came from Denmark and North Germany and settled on Tyneside in the 5th century CE. They formed the Kingdom of Northumbria by the 7th century, and that was what reached the Firth of Forth. Now, obviously, I can't talk about the Geordie dialect without explaining where the name comes from. So why are Geordies called Geordies? Well, there's, again, theories. No one's 100% sure, but the main theory is that it dates to the 18th century because the term Geordie denoted a supporter of the Hanoverian dynasty comprised of 4 King Georges. And that's opposed to the Jacobites, or supporters of the Stuart line descended from King James II. During the 1715 Rising, those in Northumberland and its market towns chose to support the Stuarts and were therefore Jacobite, while Newcastle closed the gates in support of the Hanoverians and thus became Geordies. There are other theories where it was actually an insult based on King George III and things like that. There's another theory that it actually came from uses of George Stephenson's mining lamp, but a lot of these are quite difficult to prove, and that's basically a common issue with folklore. Now, the dialect has often drawn criticism, as I think it still does in some places. I have had people occasionally not complain about my accent, but say that they can't really understand certain things, and that's one of the reasons why I have the captions on the videos on YouTube. Plus, it's also just quite nice to say how names and place names and whatnot are spelled as well. And there was a few incidents when I used to live in London where I would definitely be treated a particular way because I had a regional accent, and worse, I had a regional accent from the north. And there is very much a north-south divide in this country, and there is unfortunately still a stereotype of the northeast as being a particular type of person. But as I say, the dialect has drawn criticism way back in history. So in 1332, the English Parliament apparently worried that people were speaking less French, and other people were worrying if English could actually replace Latin or French as an official language. Northern dialects, however, were considered completely unintelligible, and chronicler Ranulph Higden described the dialect of Northumbria as, and I quote, so sharp, piercing, rasping and unformed, end quote, complaining that Southerners couldn't understand it. Now, he believed that was because we were, and I quote, near to foreigners and aliens, end quote, but also because English kings had never actually lived near Northumbria, and that sounds like a them problem as far as I'm concerned. Playwright J.B. Priestley was actually billeted on Tyneside in 1915 and hated the dialect. He described it as, and I quote, a most barbarous, monotonous and irritating twatting, end quote. So, thanks for that, J.B. Priestley. Nowadays, the Geordie accent rather than the dialect is often popular around the country, and a poll in 2021 suggested that Geordie was the least irritating accent out of 10 on offer, because it took 4 minutes and 19 seconds for people to find the accent annoying, while Cockney achieved maximum irritation in just 58 seconds. So you also sometimes see polls about the fact that people feel like Geordies are more trustworthy to speak to at call centres and things like that. So I think the accent has finally started to gain some kind of traction, particularly as we hear more of it on TV. There obviously are more Geordie TV presenters, or at least people from the northeast, if not specifically Geordies, and I think people are a little bit more familiar with it than they perhaps used to be. But as I say, it still sometimes seems to raise a few eyebrows. But I thought it would be really interesting to have a look at some examples of the Geordie dialect so that you can go away knowing some Geordie words. And authors have literally written dictionaries of Geordie, so there's way more content than I could ever hope to cover in one episode. Many words contained in such dictionaries have also fallen out of use, particularly because they were largely composed in the 1960s and 1970s. And as it is, you're actually a lot less likely to hear the Geordie dialect here, and you're more likely to hear slang or generational terminology instead. So I went through the new Geordie dictionary, and I've chosen phrases from that based on the ones that I either use myself or am at least familiar with, because other ones I was like, I've never actually heard that before. I've literally never heard anyone say that. And some of them, it's also just a pronunciation thing, like people pronouncing town as toon or down as doon and things like that. So I thought I'm not going to put those ones in, but I'll put the ones in that I think are more interesting in some ways. For anyone obviously listening to this on YouTube, at least you'll have the benefit of the subtitles, and these are going to be hilarious to try and write out phonetically, because obviously the Geordie dialect is a spoken one, not a written one. So there we go. But anyway, we're going to start off with ad, meaning old. We've got I warned you, or I warned you, I told you that would happen. Obviously the most famous one is probably I for yes, which is not specific to Geordie at all, but obviously you then get the likes of why I, meaning of course. I hate it when I hear people say why I man, because very few Geordies actually say that, just so you're aware, but that is of course, one of these phrases. We've got another one which I hadn't realised wasn't a widely known one, and I think I have heard other people use it, but I can't remember where they're from, and that's the idea of back of beyond, meaning far away. So if you live in the back of beyond, you live far away from somewhere, or you live somewhere that's like difficult to get to, or perhaps difficult to access in some way. We've got Ben, meaning child. Barney, meaning argument. Bid is an interesting one because it means an invite, but it's to something like a wedding or a funeral, which would then look like an insult if you said no. But it can also mean things like, someone might say, D is your bid, meaning do as you're told. So it depends again on context as to which one it refers to, whether it's an invite or a command. Then we've got the word bonny, meaning good looking, but it can also mean you're a good tempered person. So a bonny bairn would be a cute child, but you might refer to someone as a bonny lad who is a good friend. Obviously, canny is probably one of our more famous words. And while obviously there's all the definitions in Freud around what canny and uncanny mean, for us canny is very much a positive term. It's pretty much only ever used as a compliment, and it's basically used in that sense of you're a good or kind person. We might refer to someone as being a canny body, meaning they're a canny person. And again, you're just basically saying nice things about them at that point. So it is a lovely word. Then we've got chair, and that one is not spelt as in the chair that you sit on. That is C-H-A-R-E, and that's a narrow lane, and there were 21 of them on the quayside in 1800. My favourite is still there, called broad chair, which is just like a wide lane, which I think is quite funny. But yeah, that's a very sort of quite regionally specific word. We've got clamming, meaning hungry or thirsty. So you might be clamming for your lunch or clamming for a drink. Then we've got the same word in 3 different contexts. So we've got clarts, which usually means mud or some kind of like wet soil or wet dirt. Clartnon, meaning that you're messing about. So when I was little and I used to love playing with paint and art supplies, my mum would refer to me as clarting about, or clarting about rather, with paint. And then you've also got, you might call someone being common as clarts, which is basically a bit of an insult about them. We've got crabby, meaning bad-tempered, which I think isn't specific to us. But you might then refer to someone as a crabby-hard codger, who would be a bad-tempered elderly man. We've also got a bit of a weird grammatical change with the next one, because you might use the word do as D. Like, what you doing, man? But what are you doing? But then if it's followed by a word beginning with a vowel, that becomes div instead, which is particularly notable in the word divn't, meaning don't. So it's not deant, which wouldn't make sense, it's divn't. So you might say, I didn't want to Barney, it's meaning I don't want to argue. This one, I must admit, I find really funny, and it's just E, which is like an exclamation of delight, or like you say at the beginning of a story, like you're about to share like a really juicy piece of gossip, and you go, E, you'll never guess what I heard. And it's really funny, it tends to mostly be used by women, and I hadn't realised how much I did it until someone pointed it out. So that's always quite a funny one. Then we've got fettle, meaning condition, often related to mood. So you might say, oh, he's in a right fettle, for someone who's in a bad mood. We have fit as a lop, meaning that you're hale and hearty. Ganny is a grandmother. Then we've also got a word which turns up in different phrases, like had, which means hold. So you might say had ya gob, meaning shut up, or had thee wished, which is like hold on, wait your turn, sort of thing. Then we've got hacky, meaning dirty. Had away means like, it can sort of mean like, oh, go on then, or give over sort of thing. Or you can also use like had away with you, meaning be gone. So had away kind of has like multiple meanings depending on context. Hinny is honey, as in a term of endearment. But again, it depends on the intonation of how it's said. So you might be like, Devon, speak to me, like that hinny would be like, you know, you're using a term of endearment, but in order to like have a go at someone, if that makes sense. But then otherwise you might be using it as someone would use the word honey. We've got hoity-toity, meaning putting on airs and graces. A howdy is a midwife. The word hoy means to throw, so you're hoying something to someone. Which I think in other parts of the country might chuck something to someone, but hoy is quite a good one. It's quite a fun one to say. Which then leads us to hoynut time, or closing time at the pub. I'd be fascinated to know if this one appears elsewhere in the country, and that's hunkers, which is actually your haunches when you're crouching. So if you're sort of on your hunkers, you're essentially doing that weird pose where you're not kneeling, but you're kind of balancing like in a crouch position. So I'll sit down on my hunkers would basically mean I'm going to crouch. Then we've got hjem or home, so I'm going hjem, I'm going home. It was quite funny when I used to work in London. I did say at one point, oh, I'm going to go and get some scran. And one of the other members of staff was like, I'm sorry, what? I was like, sorry, I'm going home, so I'm going to get some lunch. She's like, why didn't you say that? And I'm like, and miss the look on your face. But yeah, this is where obviously occasionally I forget and use the wrong words. Anyway, this one you will have heard me say because it's just how I speak. And that's where we use like is to mean me. It's like, give us it here, meaning give me it. So is, whenever you hear me say that, I actually mean me when I'm saying that. We then have lad, meaning a boy, but often used to refer to a boyfriend. So I'm saying me lad would mean I'm saying me boyfriend. Or then you've got lass, meaning a girl, but often used to refer to a female partner in the same way. You will have also heard me say in the middle of that sentence, I'm saying me boyfriend. We use me instead of my. Again, that's the dialect for you. We've got the word midden, meaning a dunghill or heap, not to be confused with the black middens, which are rocks at the entrance to the town. But, you know, if people used to have the midden man who would go around and clean out toilets and all that kind of horrible stuff. The word mind appears in Geordie, but not to be used in the way that you would think. And it often means something like remember. So mind you didn't stop our lang would be like, be sure you don't stay too long. So mind, I think, gets used like that in a few places. People will use mind instead of remember, and that's kind of how we use it, or be sure to. If you're knocked, you're annoyed. Neb means nose, but it's often used in relation to curiosity. So give a neb or giz a neb would be like, let me have a look. Which is why you would describe someone who's nosy as being nebby. So you might say, oh, I'm just being nebby, meaning I'm being nosy. And somehow nebby sounds a lot less horrible than nosy in a lot of ways. We've got another quite famous Geordie word, the netty, or outdoor lavatory. And that is as unpleasant as it sounds. Nout is just nothing. That one's quite straightforward. Then we've got pan haggity I wanted to put in because this is a traditional Northumbrian dish of potatoes, onions and grated cheese. I don't necessarily know that you can get it elsewhere, although it probably just has a different word in other places. I did want to put pet in because there was actually some consternation about whether people found it patronising or not. Personally, I love the word pet because much like hinny, it can be used dependent on intonation and context. But again, it's usually used as a term of endearment. And, you know, if someone sort of said, oh, yeah, read pet, someone's like, are you all right? You know, but yeah, generally you're not using it in a derogatory sense, if that makes sense. If on the other hand, didn't speak to me like that, pet, obviously the different intonation on the pet would show that you weren't being complimentary at that point. But it is not a patronising word at all. I quite like it because it's really gender neutral as well. So it's not like darling or something like that. It, you know, because you can, obviously anyone can really use it. But yeah, pet is quite a popular one. My favourite word ever is plodge, which means wading in water in bare feet. So I'm gan for a plodge basically means I'm going to wade in the sea. But I think the plodge just sounds like a much nicer word. And it's kind of the noise your foot makes when it goes in the water. So plodge is a good one. We've got scad, meaning scald. So if something's scadding het, it's scalding hot. Scran I've already mentioned, which is basically food. Spuggy I might have mentioned in the sparrow episode because it's what we call house sparrows. We've got tommy noddies, which are puffins. We've got war, meaning our, spelled W-O-R. So you might refer to a family member as like, oh, war Bob, because it's like our Bob, as in he belongs to our family. And also you can use it any way you'd use our, but that's traditionally the way that we would use it. And use is the plural you. So where in English, obviously, if you're using different pronouns and you're referring to a group of people, most people would just use you to refer to the entire group, and people would understand they meant the entire group when someone said you, because there's a group there. No, we stick an S on the end because we just do that. But there we go. So they're the ones that I think stood out for me anyway as words that I thought people might be interested in, or you might have also heard me use occasionally. As I say, some of them I use quite a lot, some of them I don't really use at all, but I just think that they're cool words. And obviously things, the food-based ones. I didn't include stotties. Now, stotties are fabulous. And how do you describe a stotty? They're like a flat bread cake that's sort of baked in a particular way. And you can't find them in other parts of the country. They just have different names. So I have come across them as farm cakes. I think it was over in Cheshire. And I've seen them in other places with similar names. But we call them stotties because you stot them off the side of the oven. We're quite literal like that. I might end up doing a whole episode just on northeastern food at this rate, but never mind. Now, obviously, there may be fellow Geordies out there who've never heard some of these phrases, and obviously that's fine. Some of them will depend on the area of Tyneside that you're from, and others will depend on the community in which you grew up. The New Geordie Dictionary includes a lot of dialect words related to mining, but obviously I don't come from a mining community, and sadly, thanks to governmental decisions in the 1980s, many of them have now been destroyed. So that's why I've kind of focused on the ones that I actually am aware of and do use, rather than trying to claim something that I don't use. Now, I am hoping that this very short introduction to a rich dialect also reveals the rich and varied regional culture that birthed it. It does hark back to our Angle ancestors, it links us with our Scottish cousins, and it also preserves the industries that once made us great, even if those industries no longer exist. And I also hope that it gives you a different perspective on language, particularly the idea that you need to speak proper English, because there isn't any such thing. Yes, grammar is a good thing to try and use correctly, because grammar is the bit that helps your point to be understood correctly, particularly punctuation, but ultimately spoken English is basically a hybrid of truly monstrous proportions, and it is very flexible, and English's ability to absorb new words is weirdly one of its strengths. And I think that if a dialect is a form of a language specific to a group or a region, then we should embrace them, not strive to eradicate them. And I think if somebody listens to me and goes, oh, she sounds really thick because I've got a Geordie accent, that is very much a you problem. That is not my problem. And I think that says a lot about the person who holds those kind of prejudices and so on. Because after all, the dialect can tell us as much about the people who speak it as anything else does, and that should be a prime concern for folklorists. So I hope you've enjoyed that whistle-stop tour of Geordie. And I know there's obviously certain ways that I've pronounced things in the past people have been quite tickled by. Like the Town Moor episode when I kept going moor, because that's how we pronounce the word more. I don't actually know what I'm doing next week yet, but I do have a lovely list of requests that people have sent in, so I'll start having a look through those and seeing which ones will work quite nicely with Miscellaneous Month. And other things that people have requested have actually given birth to an entire theme, so we've got plenty of stuff still to have a look at throughout the rest of 2025. And I can't believe that the podcast is 6 this year. I just think that's absolutely amazing, but never mind. Anyway, welcome to 2025, and I will see you next week with our next episode. Cheerio. Well, thanks for listening, and I hope you enjoyed that episode. If you did, feel free to leave a review wherever you listen to podcasts, because that helps other people find the show too. It also takes between 4 and 6 hours to research, write, record and edit these episodes, so if you want to help support my time in doing that, then you can buy me a coffee, or you can join the Fabulous Folklore family on Patreon and enjoy extra benefits, including exclusive episodes and articles and even illustrated talks. All the links you need are below, and thanks in advance.